Okay, so you guys know how much we love to dig into these kind of documents, and we've got a fascinating set for this deep dive blueprints for a potential conservative administration in 2025. And let me tell you, this isn't just about who gets which office. This is about fundamentally changing how the government operates.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. We're talking about excerpts from Mandate for Leadership,
Catchy title.
right? It's a whole project laying out conservative strategies for governing, and it's fascinating stuff. The overarching theme, I'd say, is this really firm belief that executive power needs to be used way more directly.
It's like they're saying, look, we won the election, time to actually govern.
Exactly. And they see a big part of that as reshaping the federal bureaucracy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they argue it's become too big, too sprawling, too willing to go its own way.
Even if that clashes with what the president wants.
Exactly. They see it as a real problem. And one thing that really jumped out at me on that front was the emphasis on staffing,
Oh, yeah.
even for roles that you wouldn't think are that important.
You're talking about that suggestion that even someone like the head gardener at the White House should be totally on board with the president's agenda.
That's the one. I mean, it struck me as a little much at first.
It does feel very, very specific. Like every single person from the Oval Office to the mailroom needs to be on board with the vision.
Yeah, but they're arguing that every position, no matter how small it seems, contributes to the administration as a whole.
Interesting.
It actually reminded me of how Reagan approached staffing back in the day. He was incredibly intentional about appointing officials who shared his conservative ideology.
So it's about building a cohesive team from day one.
Exactly. Making sure everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet.
Okay, so we've got a strong executive, a unified team. What about Congress? How does this vision play out when it comes to dealing with the legislative branch?
They actually dedicate a big chunk of the document to the Office of Legislative Affairs.
Really?
Yeah, they put a ton of emphasis on presenting a united front to Congress.
Well, yeah, because if different parts of the White House are saying different things,
It's a recipe for disaster.
and they seemed especially concerned about that, like it's been a recurring problem.
They say that kind of inconsistency can be really damaging. Even with a congressional majority, a divided White House can make it almost impossible to get anything done.
I imagine. It'd be like trying to herd cats. So much for hoping to get anything passed, right?
Right. And it shows how important discipline and clear messaging are in government. If you want to get your agenda through, your team has to be on the same page. Otherwise, you're giving Congress an open invitation to exploit those weaknesses.
Okay, so we've got a strong executive, a unified team, a clear message for Congress, all very important, but I know you're eager to dig into the policy specifics.
Oh, me too. And let me tell you, they do not hold back.
I bet.
From national security to agriculture, these documents lay out a sweeping vision for how a conservative administration would totally reshape the federal landscape.
So this deep dive into potential conservative strategies for 2025, I mean, it's been fascinating so far. We've gone from these big ideas about executive power to like the importance of a unified White House team. But let's get into the policy specifics.
Right. Let's do it.
What's first up on the agenda?
Well, they start with national security.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's a big one for any administration.
Always a top issue. So what jumped out at you from these documents?
One thing that kept coming up was this concern about politicization within the intelligence community. They really emphasized the need to restore unbiased intelligence reporting. Like, that's the top priority for them.
Interesting. So they're saying the intel coming from these agencies isn't objective.
Yeah. They point to instances where they believe intelligence was manipulated, or at least presented in a way to fit a certain political agenda.
You know, now that you mention it, I do seem to recall some controversies about that in past administrations.
Exactly. And while we can't always know the full truth about these things, the authors of this document clearly believe a course correction is needed. They even propose a pretty major restructuring of how intelligence is gathered and analyzed.
Wow. So it's not just about gathering more intel.
Not necessarily. It's more about making sure that the intel they do get is accurate and that it's presented without any spin.
Objectivity over quantity.
Exactly. It's about making sure the information being used for those big national security decisions is as reliable as possible.
Fascinating. And this desire for a shift in priorities, it's not just limited to the intelligence world, is it?
Nope, not at all. This concern about effective governance and the right priorities, it comes up in a lot of different areas.
Like where?
Well, for example, let's switch gears completely for a second and talk about agriculture.
Agriculture. Okay, that's a hard left turn. What's the conservative game plan when it comes to farms and food?
So they argue that the USDA, the Department of Agriculture,
Yeah.
they say the USDA needs to completely rethink its whole mission. They believe it should focus on one thing above all else: efficient food production.
Really? So less about organic farming or, those other approaches.
Yeah, it seems like their focus is more on food security, food prices,
Yeah.
making sure there's enough food to go around
Yeah.
and that it's affordable.
Okay, I can see that. Especially with climate change and everything else going on, food security is a huge issue. But that does feel like a pretty big shift for the USDA, right? I
Yeah.
mean, don't they handle a lot more than just how much corn we grow?
They do. And that's where we see that theme of reassessing priorities again.
How so?
Well, the document acknowledges that issues like environmental protection, supporting small farms, all that's important. But they argue that those things shouldn't come at the expense of the USDA's main job, which in their view is making sure we've got a stable and plentiful food supply.
So are there any specific programs or policies that they would change?
Oh, yeah, there are a bunch. But one example that really stood out to me was their take on the Conservation Reserve Program. Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, vaguely. Doesn't that have something to do with paying farmers not to farm?
Exactly. It pays farmers to keep certain land undeveloped for conservation purposes.
Right. I knew it sounded familiar. Okay, so what do they want to do about it?
Well, they argue that with everything that's happened lately, like the war in Ukraine and its impact on global food prices, it might be time to rethink whether taking so much land out of production makes sense.
So with the potential for food shortages, we need every acre we can get to grow more.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
And it really underscores their point that for a conservative administration, prioritizing what they see as the most essential functions of government, even if it means shaking things up a little, that's key.
So we're seeing a real theme here of streamlining and prioritizing. From the intelligence community to agriculture. What other areas do they highlight in their quest for a more, shall we say, focused government? So we're seeing a real theme here of streamlining and prioritizing from the intelligence community to agriculture. What other areas do they highlight in their quest for a more, shall we say, focused government?
Well, this idea of streamlining and prioritizing, it really comes to a head when they talk about government agencies.
Makes sense. Agencies are kind of where the rubber meets the road, right?
Right.
So what are they thinking? What kind of changes are on the table?
One thing that really stood out to me was this big emphasis they put on what they call empowering citizens.
Okay.
Their argument is that over time, federal agencies, they become really disconnected from the people they're supposed to be serving.
Yeah, I've heard that before. It's a common complaint, right? That
Yep.
agencies get bogged down in bureaucracy, lose sight of the bigger picture.
Exactly. And they argue that it's created this system where unelected bureaucrats in Washington have way too much power.
And the people they're supposed to represent feel ignored.
Exactly. So their solution is basically to shrink the size and scope of these agencies. Less red tape, more control at the local level, that sort of thing.
Which fits with the whole conservative belief in limited government,
Right.
right?
Exactly. It's all about that core principle of decisions being made closer to the people. They see it as a way to make government more accountable, more responsive to the needs of individual communities.
I mean, it makes sense in theory, but what about those issues that really do require a national response? If everything is left up to the states, don't we end up with a confusing patchwork of policies? Doesn't that sometimes cause more problems than it solves?
They do acknowledge that concern in the document, but they argue that in a lot of cases, the federal government has just gone too far.
Overreached.
Right. Stepped into areas that are really better left to the states to handle.
So it's all about finding that balance.
Exactly. Where do you draw the line between federal oversight and local control? Not easy.
Definitely not. So do they give us any concrete examples? What agencies are they looking to overhaul?
Oh, absolutely. And I thought of you on this one. They specifically talk about the Department of Education.
Ooh, okay. Now you're speaking my language. What do they have in mind?
Well, they argue that the Department of Education has become a perfect example of what they're talking about.
Too big.
Too bureaucratic, out of touch with the needs of students and teachers and parents.
So what's the plan?
They actually propose a significant downsizing.
Wow.
Yeah, potentially even eliminating some programs altogether or converting them to block grants.
Block grants, right. Remind me how those work again.
Sure. Basically, it means they'd take funding that's currently earmarked for specific federal programs and instead give it to states in big chunks.
With fewer strings attached.
Exactly.
So the states have more flexibility in how they spend the money.
Exactly. Less dictation from Washington, more freedom at the local level.
It's an interesting debate and a really complex one. I mean, where do you draw that line? How much say should the federal government have in education? It's a tough one.
It really is. And to be honest, I don't think these documents pretend to have all the answers, but they offer a very clear vision for a different approach.
One that's definitely going to get people talking.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, we have covered a ton of ground today. From the Oval Office to farming to education reform, it seems like everything is on the table.
It's a pretty ambitious agenda.
It is. So if you had to boil it down, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What's the headline here?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is this. These documents, they basically lay out a blueprint for a completely different kind of government, more strategically aligned and driven by a very clear conservative vision.
And a vision that's sure to generate some pretty spirited debate, which is exactly what we like to see here at the Deep Dive.
Couldn't agree more. The more informed we all are, the better.
Couldn't have said it better myself. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us on this deep dive into a potential conservative agenda. And to our listeners, as always, thank you for being here. Knowledge is power, and we'll keep bringing you the insights you need to stay ahead of the curve.